Welcome everybody, come on in. It's great to see everyone. Let's give people about one more minute to make their way into the Zoom room. Hope everybody got to be outside today. It's so beautiful out. All right. Well, we may have a few more people trickle in, but Miriam, are you good if we get started now? Okay, so let me just welcome everybody. It's nice to see all of you. And I'm excited to be back for this third installment of What Tevya Left Behind. It's been just really interesting. Learned a lot, a different kind of Jewish learning than we usually do at Kolami, and I have been so fascinated by the learning that we've been doing. So I wanna thank all of those of you who have been here over the last couple of sessions and joined us again this evening. Those who donated to help make this program possible, and the members of the Adult Ed Committee, under the leadership of Karen Pakin and Dan Burchuk, who have planned this and many programs over the course of this year. So it's been a great year of learning. And with that, I will turn things over to Miriam Borden for our third installment of What Tevya Left Behind. Thanks, Miriam. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Rabbi. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Yeah, the third installment. We made it. I'm really excited to be here again, and I hope we have a really fun conversation tonight. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a recap of last week. So a bit of a refresher and a video that I had wanted to show you, but sort of didn't really have time to do. So yeah, I'm just going to let the video speak for itself. It's Rachel Auerbach, who was a very well-known survivor of the war, very instrumental in the resistance movement in the Warsaw Ghetto, a member of the Oinig Shabbos, the Emanuel Ringelblum's network of historians and archivists and scholars and researchers who collected this incredible archive of life in the Warsaw Ghetto. There's a film about it. There's a book about it. It's called Who Will Write Our History? I recommend it. Anyway, this is a clip of Rachel Auerbach narrating a part of her, I believe this comes from her own memoirs. So I'm going to, without further ado, I'll let Rachel speak.
When I came to Warsaw for the first time in the early 1930s, I was astonished at the intensity of Jewish life. Such a multitude of Jews I had never seen. Pious Jews in black gabardines, looking like priests in their medieval garb. Jews who were rabbis, teachers who wanted to transform our earthly life into a long study of Torah and prayer to God. And still other Jews, broad-shouldered, deep-voiced. Jews who, with a blow of their fists, could floor any hooligan who dared enter into their neighborhoods.
Rachel Arbach belongs to the first generation of Polish Jews who got a higher education. She became a journalist and a leading member of the Yiddish-Polish intelligentsia.
She was a literary art and film critic. She wrote about women's literature, but also about position of women in contemporary society. She emphasized the double exclusion Jewish women were experiencing as women and as Jews.
In Warsaw, there were 6 Yiddish daily papers and 2 dailies in the Polish language. There were 2 steady Yiddish theaters and many traveling troops. The Yiddish Literary and Journalist Union had 400 members. This Jewry had about 100 modern Jewish schools in Warsaw alone. A state within a state, the Polish anti-Semites screamed. And there was slight truth in that, especially culturally.
So that, I think, reminds us a little bit where we sort of left off last time we met, which is that Warsaw is this teeming Jewish metropolis. It is a complex place, of course, but so is all of Eastern Europe in the 1920s and 30s. And it's going to become more complicated, as we know, as time goes on. I want to spend tonight exploring a couple of more of these centers of intra-war Yiddish culture that are really important for understanding the fullness of the experience of being a Jew in Eastern Europe in the 1920s and 30s, in this era. The first place I want to go, actually, before we do that, there we are. Before we do that, I almost forgot. I wanted to quickly review the Yiddish we have learned so far. Like I said last time, I will compile this into a document that, Karen, maybe you can share around when we are finished, and it'll be a reference sheet for future Yiddish adventures. So we began with "Was machst du?" And again, I'm going to ask you all tonight, "Was machst du?" How are you? Because we're a large group, there are more than one person here, both actually say, "Was macht ihr?" How are you all? Also a way to ask in a more formal sense, if you're speaking to somebody at a higher social status or something. Was macht ihr? How are you all? And more colloquially, was macht a Yid? How's a Jew doing? And as we said, there are multiple answers to that question, sometimes complicated. Sehr gut, keine Hora. Very good, really well, no evil eye. And remember we talked about the fact that you never want to report on your condition, whether good or bad, without some kind of qualifier, like no evil eye, God forbid, thank God, so far, okay. Frag nicht, that's a good one. Don't ask, not good, don't even bother asking. Frag nicht. Die Putter is Arop. I see this all the time, by the way, in written out in letters from family members in Poland to the US, usually during the Depression. This is something they always say. The putter is up, the butter is up, which means everything's up in the air. It's insane. It's not a good situation. Everything is just a mess. It's chaos. Mishlept sich, that's a good one. I'm dragging myself. I'm muddling through. Somehow I'm making it through. Mishlept sich. Zich means it's a reflexive word. It refers back to the person speaking. So mishlept sich, I'm schlepping myself. And melebt Baruch Hashem. I'm living, thank God. What more can you ask for? I'm living, thank God. Okay. So with these, the first place I actually want to stop tonight may seem a little bit odd in talking about Yiddish centers, Berlin. In Yiddish, Berlin. It is in the especially after the First World War, it is a Eastern European expats paradise. And why is it a paradise for people from Eastern Europe? Because in the East, especially in the years immediately following the armistice in 1918, so 1918, 1919, there's a civil war in Ukraine. It's a really tumultuous time in the East. There are also pogroms. There's revolution happening in Russia. There's a lot going on. It's a busy time. It's a dangerous time. It's an uncertain time. And those who could escaped and went to Western Europe if they could. And Berlin sort of becomes this, especially during the early years of the Weimar Republic, Berlin becomes this place that is so far from that. It is a democratic experiment. It is vibrant. It is full of artistic life. Especially if you're a Jewish artist, whether that's in the visual arts or literary arts, in the theater, in music, Weimar Berlin is a place you want to be. And so, and it does become a place, sort of a stopover, a very brief stopover for many of the writers we have discussed, of the activists we've discussed, of the people we've discussed. Not everybody goes to Berlin. Berlin is very different, of course, but some do go. What's interesting is that what's compelling about Berlin, of course, is that in the days of the Prussian Empire, so before the First World War, of course, Germany, German culture, it's the center of high European culture. Later, in this period, in the 1920s, it becomes a center of avant-garde art and culture. So it's this really dynamic, exciting place. In addition, something that is very tempting to many of our expats from Eastern Europe is that post-war inflation, the economic crisis Germany was experiencing immediately following the First World War, was very attractive to foreign publishers whose money was worth a lot more there. So Yiddish and Hebrew publishers found many opportunities for publishing journals and books of a very different kind from the ones we discussed last week. And that's what I want to show you now. I want to jump into this, Milgräum. Milgräum in Yiddish means pomegranate. And this is a magazine that premiered in Berlin in 1922. It only had 6 issues. It stopped its run in 1924. Like I said, this was a very brief but very productive time for many Yiddish and Hebrew cultural activists. You can see already from the cover, I think, it's very different from the journals we saw last week, which were modernist and radical and very experimental. We saw one from Jung Yiddish in Lodz that was printed on packing paper. This is not that. This is something very, very different. And the reason I want to spend a little bit of time on this tonight is because I think Milgräum really sits at the intersection of several questions that were really, really important to Yiddish cultural figures and Eastern European Jews in general during this period. And these are questions of art, questions of literature, questions of a Jewish aesthetic. Is there such a thing as a Jewish aesthetic? This is the question that I think we still grapple with today. And there are a range of very compelling answers to that question. Milgräum had a particular perspective. As we said, the years following the First World War were an extraordinarily productive time for Yiddish avant-garde literary and artistic periodicals. This is one example. And they were a blend of radicalism, experimentation, and this sort of transnational spirit of Jewish modernism in Central and Eastern Europe. All of them, Milgräum included, lasted about 2 or 3 years. It was a very short run for all of these journals. And these journals tend to be fiercely political. They are very much involved in the moment and very much concerned with where this moment is going to lead us. It's this really uncertain time immediately following that First World War. This is a journal edited by a husband and wife team, Mark Vishnitzer and Rachel Vishnitzer. Both of them are trained historians of Jewish art. Rachel Vishnitzer is super interesting. She was the art editor of this magazine. We'll go inside the magazine in just a second. She was one of the first people to work on some of the material that was being researched and still sort of discovered from the Middle East. I forget exactly which ones she worked on, but she's a super interesting person because she also spent a lot of time working with Jewish medieval manuscripts, and she established some of our first understanding of what is a Jewish medieval manuscript. How do we understand a medieval Haggadah, for example, in the context of other medieval manuscripts in Europe, Christian manuscripts, and so on. Like other journals, Milgräum blends, as you're going to see in a second. Here you go. It's a blend of text and image. You see right here on that very first page, this is the very first issue. This is an essay on the left by Rachel Vishnitzer. It's called Die Neue Kunst und mir, which is the new art and us. And she's talking about the new movements in modernism. And of course, juxtaposed right next to that on the other page is this beautiful reproduction of a medieval manuscript page, the Halach Ma'anya page from a medieval Haggadah. What's interesting about Milgräum, and maybe you can see this already from the way a medieval Haggadah appears on the inside on one of the first pages, is that Milgräum takes a different approach to this kind of radical break with with older forms of Jewish art, with older forms of Jewish literature. Milgrom is interested in synthesizing the old and the new. And in so doing, it makes a really interesting statement about Jewish modernism, about the Jewish past, about the direction of Jewish art. You know, for example, where the other journals we saw last week were very interested in rejecting the old stuff, the myth, the history. They have no use for that history because what they're interested now is in the moment. This is a very different perspective. This is a perspective that goes rummaging. It's a little more conservative. It goes rummaging in the past to find answers for the present. Different from radically reforming, reshaping the present out of the ruins of the past, right? This is something that actually, there's a respect for the past. Let's see what the past has to tell us and how can the past inform our present in really interesting ways. What I want to stress about Milgrom also is that maybe you can tell already, aesthetically, it's really beautiful. It's printed because of those low printing costs. It's printed on really high quality paper. They can spend time. There's a lot of white space, not so much on these pages, but on other pages, they can spend the time and spend the space to make a beautiful artistic point that the other journals really couldn't afford to do. Also, that wasn't their goal. We're going to return this on the left, this beautiful painting, this impressionistic painting of a synagogue is by the artist Yisachar Arbach. We're going to come back to him in a little bit. He was a modernist. He was also somebody who went traveling through the Pale of Settlement to different villages in the late 19 teens to paint and document shtetls that he was noticing were disappearing. And of course, again, on the opposite facing page, another reproduction of a manuscript, a medieval manuscript. So again, this beautiful blending of past and present. Sophisticated layout, very high quality paper, color images. I mean, that costs money. Ink is still very expensive. Ink was expensive then too. The other interesting thing about this journal is that, so I said it's called Milgrom, which means pomegranate. It had a cognate edition. It had another edition. It always came out in 2 editions, bilingual. One in Yiddish, that was Milgrom, and one in Hebrew called Rimon, pomegranate, right? And part of this had to do with an allusion to abundance and creativity that is rooted in, you know, both biblical Jewish culture and more recent Jewish folk culture. So that it also explains that juxtaposition of Haggadah, biblical, ancient, and modern, like the one you see here on the right. And what's interesting too about the bilingual nature of this journal is that it served the editor's intention of bringing the journal to the widest audience possible. The thing is, Germany in 1922, Berlin in 1922, Hebrew and Yiddish are not languages people are interested in reading. Jews in Germany in 1922 are reading German. Yiddish is it's an Eastern European phenomenon in many ways. And Eastern European Jews in Berlin are sort of seen as outsiders. And so this is a journal that was actually intended for export beyond Berlin. It was produced in Berlin because it was convenient and interesting. It was actually designed to be exported across the Jewish world. So for Hebrew, you make sure that readers in the Yishuv, in Palestine, in pre-state Israel, are able to access it and read it in the language they're in the process of reconstructing. In Yiddish, of course, has a much wider reach. And in fact, Milgrom was on sale. It was on sale in Berlin, certainly. It was on sale in New York, in London, England, in Montreal, in Buenos Aires, in Toronto. There were newsstands in Toronto that sold this magazine in 1922, 23, 24. And I'll just go, I don't know if I can go back, what the introductory essay wrangles with. It's a really interesting essay. When I said it's called The New Art and Us. What's at the heart of that essay are several key questions that really dominated discussions of Jewish art from the 1880s through the 1920s. So it's discussions of Jewish art that are preoccupying people for the last 40 years or so. They are questions of nationality. They're questions of race, of ethnicity. You know, where do Jews belong? Jewish art, what are its origins? What is its essence? What is its character? is, for example, is Jewish art derivative? Jewish art in many ways, if you look at a medieval manuscript page, other than the fact that it's a Haggadah and it's in Hebrew, it looks very similar to other medieval manuscripts of the time, Christian ones, Spanish ones, Latin ones. So what is the character of Jewish art? Is it derivative, or does it bring something original to the table? Does it bring something ancient? Is there an ancient core that is somehow different and somehow unique? These are questions that people were asking throughout, from the 1880s through the 1920s. And again, like I said, even today, I think, is there such a thing as a Jewish aesthetic? Like I said in the beginning, do Jews see and represent the world differently? And if so, how, right? And this gets to the question of, are Jews really European, or are they something else? Milgrom, this magazine, argued that Jewish art was both distinctively Jewish, and it had universal elements. It had deep historical roots in Europe, in the ancient world, certainly, but it also had a universal perspective that was applicable to art across Europe and across the world. That's what this journal tried to argue. It sat at this intersection of these two ideas. And, the editors took advantage of where they were, the place and time they found themselves. Like I said, they spared no expense on the layout, on the printing of this journal. They had a really good time with it. And as a result, I think the journal feels sort of soaring and expansive and creative and inspiring. And that was the idea. That was the whole point. It's rather large too. It's I guess the size of what we would consider a normal magazine today. The other journals are much smaller. And it remains today, this journal remains an example of the interwar period's most impressive and ambitious literary artistic projects. Okay. So from here, we move to the Soviet Union, in Yiddish, the Rattenverband, another new place in the world following the First World War. In a 1926 census, taken in the USSR, reported over 2 million Jews. This is, let me just explain how this breaks down a little bit. 59% of those Jews were living in Ukraine, about 15% in Belarus, 22% in Russia, what we think of as Russia proper today, and just under 4% in the other Soviet republics. I should back up and just explain, just remind us that in 1897, according to a census taken in 1897, the total Jewish population then in Russia, and remember this is still the Pale of Settlement era, right? And the Russian Empire is much bigger. The total Jewish population is about 5 million, which is about 4.25% of the total population at the time. And of that total, of this total of about 5 million people, 94% of them, the vast majority of them, are living in the 25 provinces that make up the Pale of Settlement. And the total population of the Pale of Settlement, I should say, was over 42 million. It was a massive piece of land, very dense. And of these, about 5 million were Jews. So that's about it's about 11.5%. That's the 5 million recorded in the 1897 census. Because of migration, because of the way people fled the shtetl territories during the First World War, like I said, many of those shtetl were on the front lines of battle. And of course, pogroms, especially pogroms in the late 1880s, sent a lot of people packing and heading further west to what after the war became Poland again. So by the time we get to 1926 census, we're down to about half that number. Not 5 million Jews in the USSR, but about 2.5 million. It's a very interesting situation in Soviet Union. Why? Because Yiddish is actually recognized there as an official minority language. That is not the case. Yiddish has never been recognized as an official language of anywhere, except for this one moment in time. It is part of the reason for that is that it's part of the Soviet emphasis on the culture of the folk, as the backbone of Soviet culture. This is very important to the Soviet authorities and the sort of the policymakers in the Soviet Union. There's a really interesting move to what they call to de-Judaize the Yiddish orthography, the way you write Yiddish, the way you. So of course it remained written in the Hebrew script, but certain words like Shabbos, certain words like Rachmunus, words that are very much a part of the Yiddish vocabulary were written out phonetically rather than written out in the Hebrew word. Normally you would just take that Hebrew word, Shabbos, and put it into the Yiddish sentence. They decided, no, because it's about a secular Soviet culture, we're going to de-Judaize, take the Jewishness out of the language. It's a little bit absurd because, of course, Yiddish is a very Jewish language with a lot of Hebrew words. Be that as it may, that's what they did. And it's really interesting to look today, to look back at books published in the Soviet Union from the 1920s through the 1960s, in fact, that use that orthography, that have these kind of weird oddities in the spelling, in the writing. If you know anything about Hebrew writing, the certain letters have a final form, like a nun, a mem, and a pei, a fei, and they removed those from the language. That's another example of how they de-Judaize the language, try to make it as secular as possible. So, and you see this still in examples of books published in that period. It's really interesting and a little bit hard to read. So yeah, so Yiddish becomes state supported. This is, I cannot stress how unique this is. There's state support for Yiddish publishing. There's state support for Yiddish theater and schools. Again, that remains unique to this day. The thing is that Stalin, at one point, said that to qualify as a nation, a minority within the Soviet Union had to have a language, a culture, and a homeland. Okay, so we've got the language, that's Yiddish. The culture is proletarian socialist literature and arts. This is literature and arts that are very concerned with the workers, very concerned with the economic, well, the distribution of wealth, very concerned with corruption and corrupt bosses, and not a fan of wealth, not a fan of rich people, skeptical of rich people, and so on. Bear with me one moment. Right. This did not mean, of course, that Judaism and the legacies of Jewish history were not important to Jews living there, even though they did adopt this proletarian socialist stance. Jewish history and the legacy and Judaism were important to these people. And the art they produced in this period reflects that. They reflect a desire to see a new sun dawn on Jewish life. They see this as an opportunity to remake Jewish life anew in a more equitable way, in a way that people are not impoverished, that people are not limited in what kind of work they can do, limited in their education. They really saw this as a new opportunity with untold potential for Jews. And we'll see this in some of the art that we're going to look at in just a minute, they saw this new Soviet sun as a sun that embraced folklore, embraced the imagery and the folk heritage of the shtetl, while also, leaving behind the provincialism of the shtetl and walking into a new world of untold opportunity. And in a minute, we're actually going to look at a bit of an essay by David Bergerson, who was a very, very important Yiddish modernist writer, where he makes the point in very colorful language. We'll see that a little bit later. The other thing is, part of the proletarian socialist literature and art movement was, you see bursts of this in various forms throughout the Soviet Union. One thing really important, the Kulturliga, which is the Culture League in Yiddish. It's a Jewish cultural and social organization founded in Kiev in 1918, 1919. There's this really brief moment where Ukraine has this sort of moment of independence before war breaks out and everything crumbles apart. And the Kulturliga was founded there. They supported education for children and adults in Jewish literature, in the theater, in the arts. The organization sponsored art exhibitions and art classes, and they also published books written by some of the most accomplished authors in the Yiddish language. And these books were illustrated often by artists who would be in time become really the movers and shakers in modernist circles across Europe. Three of these artists, Issachar Ber-Ribak, who I mentioned earlier, El Lissitzky, and of course, Marc Chagall. I'm not going to talk too much about Marc Chagall. I think we're all familiar enough with Marc Chagall. I'm going to talk a little bit more about El Lissitzky and Issachar Ber-Ribak. They're two of my favorites, so I'm biased, but they were also really important. I take my word for it. So Marc Chagall founded an art school in his hometown of Vitebsk in Belarus in 1918. And it eventually became one of the most important schools for Soviet art. One of the teachers there was El Lissitzky, this fellow in the middle. El Lissitzky was a Russian Jewish artist, designer, photographer, art teacher, of course, typographer, architect. You see his name appear in books on modern typography that have nothing to do with Jews or Jewish art or the Soviet Union. His influence is just that vast. He was one of the most important figures of the Russian avant-garde. He began by illustrating Yiddish children's books as part of an effort to promote Jewish culture in the Soviet Union, but gradually he moved away from Jewish art. And maybe you can tell from some of what I'm showing you, but his work really influenced the Bauhaus movement, the constructivist movements, and he experimented with production techniques and stylistic devices that would go on to dominate 20th century graphic design. Graphic design students today, I don't know if they spend a lot of time, but they certainly come across the name El Lissitzky. Like I say, his influence is just vast. And this is some of what he worked on. In the late 19-teens, so just after the First World War, I'm sorry, Lissitzky and Ribak traveled throughout the Russian countryside together. They were studying Jewish folk art and life. And later they memorialized the countryside that they went and visited in the 1920s, when by that point pogroms had left much of that landscape and that population devastated, right? As we said, the shtetl era sort of ended with the First World War. And one example of this, a really good example of this, is this book by Issachar Ber-Ribak called Shtetl, Mein Choyever Heim, a Gedenknis, My Little Town, My Destroyed Home. And it is a real tribute to the shtetl he grew up in, the shtetl that he went and documented in those waning years of the shtetl. And I want to show you some examples. They're really striking. They're really beautiful. This is some of my favorite art from this period. And you can just see the expressionist, the geometric kind of angles, I find the way he just captures movement in these beautiful ways. On the left, we're looking at a synagogue. On the right, we're looking inside the synagogue. And here's a couple more. Again, on the left, a beautiful shul and sort of shtetl life. And on the right, more of that. I'm a huge fan. His work didn't all look like this, of course. These are charcoal, but these are just some of my favorites. I wanted to share them with you. Okay, and back to our Soviet Union. The last thing, so Stalin said, in order to be a nation, you needed language, culture, you needed a homeland. So what is the homeland? Birobidzhan. And maybe some of you have heard of Birobidzhan. Birobidzhan, this picture we're looking at on the right is from the main square in Birobidzhan. I'll tell you a little bit about it. To offset the Zionist aspirations, remember Zionism is something that is gaining speed, but really still developing in the 1920s. To offset Zionist aspirations and provide a Jewish homeland within the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union is opposed to nationalism that has nothing that goes beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. In order to quell some of these Zionist aspirations and provide a more local option, they create Birobidzhan. What is Birobidzhan? Birobidzhan is established as a Jewish autonomous region in 1931. I'm going to show you where it is. It is an 8-hour plane ride from Moscow, plus 2 hours by train. It is not easy to get there. It is on the border with China, essentially. It is far, far, far away from Eastern Europe, as you can see. Today, I want to tell you that there are 75,000 residents of the town, the region of Birobidzhan, 4,000 of whom are Jews, according to the local rabbi. So there is a community there. And Yiddish remains the official language of Birobidzhan. Of course, people speak Russian, but Yiddish is, officially an official language. The Jewish population in Birobidzhan reached a peak of 30,000 before the Second World War. In 1939, that was about 20% of the overall population at the time. It included Jews from all over. It included Jews from Poland, from Romania, Germany, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Argentina, the US, even Palestine, pre-state Israel. People were excited for this new experiment. It was a new experiment. People were excited and they wanted to come see what it was all about. But during the Stalinist purges later in the 1930s, Jews in Birobidzhan were targeted. Later, after World War II, they were targeted again when Stalin embarked on his campaign against what he called, rootless cosmopolitans, which included Jews, of course, almost a code word. And eventually, nearly all the Yiddish schools in the region were liquidated, and more than half of the Jews in Birobidzhan left. Thousands of them went to Israel. So that's what happened in Birobidzhan in later years. It's not all bad, I want to tell you. In the 1990s, a Yiddish faculty was created at the Birobidzhan Pedagogical University. In 2004, the new synagogue, which we're looking at here, was opened. In 2007, the Birobidzhan International Program for Yiddish Language and Culture was launched. So, and I should say that the Russian government, for that project, for the synagogue, the Russian government allotted over $100,000 in US money to help build a synagogue. So the Russian government remains invested in certain interesting ways in this Jewish autonomous region called Birobidzhan. I wanted to hear from somebody who, in Yiddish, there are subtitles, who knows a little bit more about Birobidzhan because he's from there. This is Ber Kotlerman. He is a professor of Yiddish language and culture in Israel. Here we go.
Hat sich gegründet und hat sich angeführt mit Jiddisch Sommerprogramm in Birobidzhan. Was für ein Überlebnis ist das gewesen?
Das ist gewaltig für mich, sehr wichtig. Das ist ein Comeback. Ich komme zurück heim und ich bringe meine israelische Welt zu der Treffung mit meiner Birobidzhaner Welt. Trotz der Limudim sind gewesen verschiedene Ausformen in die gewesen jüdische Kolchosen und Treffungen mit den ersten Überwanderern, die sind noch geblieben etliche. Also. Und für mich ist es gewesen eine Möglichkeit, ein Guckton auf sich allein von einer anderen Perspektive בכלל. Ich gedenke, als wir oben gerät, Sido Städtel in Birobidzhan, das heißt Waldhill. Einer von den ersten jüdischen Kolchosen dort, was es mehr nicht kein Kolchos heißt. Oder wie vielleicht man sagen auf sowjetisch Jiddisch, Kolwirt, kollektive Wirtschaft, Kolwirt. Also es lebt dort ein Raid, was stammt von Wilne und sein Name ist Zalman Geffen. Als der Dosiker Zalman Geffen, redet äußergewöhnlich als ein schönem litwischen Jiddisch, aber hat nicht kein Bewusstsein, als das ist wichtig, בכלל. Heißt es, man fragt bei ihm, redet Jiddisch. Macht das so mit den Plätzen. Was für eine Frage, aber für was fragt ihr? Heißt es, das Ruf, solche Fragen, sie kommen von einem Standpunkt, als die jüdische Kultur ist wichtig für sich allein und jene Menschen, sie verstehen nicht, sie leben Poshet in dem, nicht in der jüdischen Kultur leben, sie leben Poshet. Ist ein Mann von Landwirtschaft, hat das in Wirtschaft dort, ein Farmer einzut. Und versteht nicht, was fragt man bei ihm, sehr Jiddisch? Heißt es ist doch wichtig, was redet man? Und nicht, wie so redet man. Versteht? Für mich, das ist gewinn interessant. Ich habe gelernt das Sach. Ich habe gemeint, dass ich weiß, schöne Sache wegen Aserbaidschan. Ich bin doch ausgewachsen dort, aber nicht. Man pflegt die ganze Zeit neue Sachen.
There you have it. Somebody who actually grew up in Azerbaijan. I want to turn to, I mentioned we were going to talk about David Bergelson. I want to turn to him now. David Bergelson is one of the most important modernist Yiddish writers who really spearheaded Jewish modernism. He was a novelist and a short story writer. You can find many of his books and his stories in English in various anthologies today. He had a more complicated relationship with the Soviet Union than most. I think I mentioned him very early on in our first session, maybe in our second. He ultimately, his life ended in the Soviet Union when on April 12th, 1952, Stalin executed some of the top Jewish cultural, I guess you would call them today, influencers, the activists, the writers, various figures who had remained in the Soviet Union. He had them executed, and this included a number of Yiddish writers. David Bergelson was one of them. Long before that, of course, he had a vision of what the Soviet Union could be, and I want to share with you a little bit of his vision. Before we go into what's on the screen, Bergerson spent his youth in Kiev, but he left the Soviet Union in 1921 after the chaos and the violence of the First World War, after the 1917 revolutions. And at first, he was a vocal critic of Soviet Jewish culture. But with the publication of this essay in 1926, he became an advocate for the project to establish a Soviet Jewish autonomous region in Azerbaijan. He was one of the supporters of that project. The essay, which is much longer, I believe I sent it to Karen, so hopefully if you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's really interesting and I would take a look at it. The essay compares Yiddish culture in the United States, in Poland, and the Soviet Union, and concludes that the future for Yiddish lies not in the US, not in Poland, but in the Soviet Union, of course. He calls it a Soviet center. He actually paints a pretty scathing portrait of America and Poland, which are the two centers that other people were considering. I should say that this discussion of where is the center of Yiddish was something that everybody was talking about in the 1920s. There are several essays. There's a symposium about it in Warsaw. Everybody's asking this question because, again, it is this moment of uncertainty. It's still a moment of global migration. And so people are asking, well, where is the center? Do we have a center for Yiddish? Do we need a center for Yiddish? So he says, in America, although the economic situation there is pretty good, it's better than anywhere else. Remember, this is before the Depression. He says that in America, the thirst for assimilation consumes Jewish artists and Jewish audiences. The people there just want to assimilate and forget. And he says, in America, the Jewish worker, there's some hope in the Jewish worker. Remember, Soviets tend to valorize the worker, but of course, the worker is beset by all the assimilation around him, and so there's very little hope. He says in Poland, there is internal unrest, there is political factionalism, and all of that is stifling the artistic creativity of the Yiddish writer, as well as the sort of literary appetite of your average Yiddish reader. He uses really interesting metaphors to describe what's going on in Poland. He describes, he's death, pallor. He sees really no future there. He says the creative soul of Yiddish in Poland is as poor as Polish Jews themselves. who live these gray, sad lives. So he's no fan of Poland. But he says that in Soviet Russia, there's a bright future for Yiddish, one that is supported by state infrastructure, as we have seen, and there's a focus on what he calls the productivization of the Jewish masses, the integration of Jews into the economic systems there. And I want to share with you this. Whoops, I'm sorry. I can't actually see it. Okay, here we go. I want to share with you what he says. Soviet Russia is the only country that gives not solely on paper, but with an iron hand and in full consciousness, demands that the equality she gives be used. And he's comparing Soviet Russia to other places that purport to give Jews equal opportunity, but don't actually do so. She demands that Jews select from among themselves a stratum of farmers, an army of workers, ranks of her own teachers and officials, Jewish schools and technical colleges, Jewish judges, Jewish lawyers, Jewish Soviets with Jewish militias, Jewish agronomists, Jewish departments in the universities, Jewish scholars and professors, Jewish leaders and government ministers. She unites the Jewish intelligentsia with the Jewish masses. She analyzes and paints gray Jewish life with a kaleidoscope of colors, and consequently, she also creates new Jewish possibilities for the new Jewish artist. And here's one more excerpt that I think is really interesting. Somewhere on the steppes occupied by Jewish farming villages, somewhere at the machine in the factory or in the workshop of the Jewish craftsman, this new Jewish artist is already ripening. Following sunrise and sunset behind the plow, filing his way between running rails of iron and steel, returning home from his work. Everywhere he finds himself, he pauses in thought for a moment and fills his eye with the surrounding colorfulness of newly flourishing Jewish life. Colorful fertilization, the song of labor and of self-sacrifice for world liberation. This will be the content of the new Yiddish book he will write. This will be the content of the new Jewish art in Soviet Russia. So I think he makes himself pretty clear. He sees a connection between physical labor, like factory work, and farming, and literature and art. He sees these things as very much connected. This is, of course, very different from previous ideas we've seen, right, about Jewish life in Eastern Europe. He imagines the destruction and the upheaval of Jewish life that's caused by the First World War, that's caused by pogroms and the revolution. He sees all that as actually creating an opportunity for Jewish creativity, for the flowering of new creativity. And it's interesting, I think the Soviet Union in Western culture is portrayed as very drab and very gray. That's how we think of it, at least. But for Bergerson, no, the Soviet future is bright and colorful and vibrant. He calls it a kaleidoscope of color. This is really, like I said, part of an ongoing discussion that Bergerson and many of his colleagues are having at the time. They're writing essays, they're holding conferences to discuss, the centers of Yiddish, the future of Yiddish, whether Yiddish even needs a center. So Bergerson writes this essay in 1926. But by 1930, the government sort of changes its mind about the Jews. The government embarks on an overall turn away from encouraging minority languages, despite, the fact that they supported Yiddish in the beginning and other languages too. And they begin to encourage Russification, right? Making people into good Russians. Many Jewish leaders, especially those with Bundist backgrounds, with leftist, socialist, territorialist, diasporist backgrounds, were arrested and executed in the purges in the 1930s. Belarus, which had this incredible network of, we saw the majority or a large majority of Jews in the Soviet Union were living in Belarus. Belarus had this huge network of Yiddish language schools with a high enrollment of 160,000 at one point. It closed its schools in 1938. So you sort of see this incredible flowering of Jewish life in the Soviet Union for a very brief time, and then a total contraction of that Jewish life. I want to move now to let's go back into, here we go. I want to go now to America, which they called the Golden Medina, the Golden Land. The situation could not be more different in America. I know we're focusing mostly on what Tevya left behind, but I want to also take a look at America because, when Tevya left Anatevka, he didn't arrive in a Yiddish wasteland. It's not that what he left behind was amazing Yiddish richness, and then what he found in America was nothing. Of course not. America too was a center for Yiddish. Despite what David Bergerson may have to say about the Yiddish future in America, in the 1920s and 30s, Yiddish was thriving. Yiddish was flourishing in with a totally different sort of tone. And the story in America during these years is very different, of course. It's far from war. It's far from the shtetl. It's kind of this new beginning, a real new beginning, not just in the Soviet sense. And because of the huge number of immigrants pouring into America, especially New York, between 1880 and 1924, there's this really vibrant Yiddish culture that is cultivated there. Between 1880 and 1924, famously or infamously, is when the US they put quotas on immigration. They effectively closed their borders to immigration. So between those years, 2.5 million Jews came to America, many of them coming from the Russian Empire, the former Russian Empire. Remember, we said that there had been about 5 million Jews living in the Pale of Settlement. By 1926, there were about 2.5 million. Well, the other 2.5 million, roughly, arrive in America. Of course, it's not only Russian Jews coming to America, but largely. 75% of those settle on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The Lower East Side of Manhattan is where the Vorwärts newspaper is founded. In 1897, the Vorwärts remains a Yiddish newspaper today, I should add. They're online now entirely, English and Yiddish, but they do issue articles in Yiddish as well as in English. The Second Avenue Yiddish Theater becomes Jewish Broadway, essentially. It's this tour de force in the Jewish performing arts. Even our own theaters here in Toronto, actually, the Standard Theater down on Spadina and Dundas, would bring traveling troops of actors from Second Avenue to Toronto to perform. The influence of Second Avenue Yiddish theater on Hollywood at large cannot be overstated. We just like in Europe, there are poetry, there's literary collectives, there's poetry, there is this radical flourishing of art and letters. The Inzichisten are one of these. Inzich means looking into oneself. It's introspectiveness. They call themselves the Inzichisten. They were another one of these radical young groups of poets. They stressed individualism, free verse, wordplay. They were really playing with all the old forms of Yiddish, of poetry, the more structured poetic forms. They said, out with that. We're going to bring something new in. There's Yiddish radio. There's a wonderful book about Yiddish radio called Station Identification, about the dozens of little local Yiddish radio stations in New York in the 1930s and 40s. Some of them, some of them only reached a few blocks away. They were very local. There's a wonderful CD, I suppose you could buy it online now, called the Yiddish Radio Project. I can certainly send a link to that. It's a wonderful series from National Public Radio in the States about Yiddish radio. And they released a CD also of some amazing songs that were aired in that time. Yiddish radio is an amazing phenomenon. There's Yiddish radio in other places too, of course. In New York, it becomes something really special and really, really fun. I want to, in the interest of time, the Inzichisten, those Yiddish poets, there's so much to say about them. I want to actually focus on one who was not exactly part of their collective. She was and she wasn't. She worked outside of it. Anna Margolin, who was born Rosa Lebensboim in Belarus in 1887. The reason I want to talk about her is because we have not talked about any female Yiddish cultural activists. We've talked about Rachel Auerbach a little bit. Women were definitely a part of this whole culture, this whole scene that we've been discussing the last 3 weeks. And Anna Margolin is a really special example of a poet with a really unique voice whose poetry I find to be still radical, still surprising, you know, and she wrote poems. She had one little book of poems that she published in 1929. And that's it. And I still find her stuff to be kind of explosive. And I wanted to share one of those with you. It's called Ich bin gewesen einmal ein Jüngling. And I'll read it first in Yiddish and we'll look together at the English. And it's just a taste. I'm sorry we don't have more time to spend with her, but Ich bin gewesen einmal ein Jüngling, gehört in Portikos Sokraten. Es hat mein Bosemfreund, mein Liebling, gehabt dem schönsten Tors in Aten. Gewesen Cäsar, und a hele Welt gebeut von Marmor. Ich der Letzte, und vor a Weib mir Oysterweilt, mein stolze Schwester. In Rosenkranz, beim Wein, bis spät, gehört in heuchmutigen Frieden, wegen Schwachling von Nazareth und wilde Meises wegen Eden. I was once a youth, listening to Socrates in porticos. My bosom friend, my darling one, had the most beautiful torso in Athens. Was Caesar, and a gleaming world built from marble. I, the last, chose for myself a wife, my proud sister. In rosy wreaths and wine till late, I heard in high spirits of the weakling from Nazareth and wild tales about the Jews. What an interesting Yiddish poem. I hope you're having the same reaction. This is probably one of the most famous poems she wrote. It's the one that is taught in university classrooms anytime anybody talks about Anna Margolin. It is so surprising in so many ways. First of all, there's nothing really Jewish about it. In fact, the only mention of Jews is, you know, this person, this Roman man, in fact, is written for the perspective of a man. This Roman man hears about the Jews, nothing beyond that. It's written in Yiddish. That may be the most Jewish thing about it, but that's the point, right? Part of the point of this of Yiddish poetry in America was we can write poetry in Yiddish. It doesn't have to be Jewish poetry. You know, it doesn't need to be on Jewish themes. We can write about whatever we want. That's the idea of Yiddish being this global language that is capable of creating literature and creating culture. It doesn't need to be limited to Jewish themes. That was very much a part of the motivation of Yiddish poets in American Yiddish poets. It's a little bit different from the motivation of poets in Eastern Europe, who are still very concerned with the shtetl, history, the tumultuous Jewish future, the moment. This is very different. This is very far away from all of that, right? And although these people come from there, they immigrate. They embrace the distance from that world. I'm looking at the time. I want to spend a couple of minutes. I want to close by talking about something that I'm hoping I will send you a link to this as soon as we enter the Q&A. I'll put it in the chat. There's a wonderful lecture happening tomorrow night online, 7 o'clock, by Eddie Portnoy, who is the author of that really fabulous article that I think that Karen sent around about Zuni Maud and Yossel Cutler, who had this really zany and really interesting Yiddish puppet theater in New York in the 1920s and 30s. And I want to give you a sneak peek. If you want to attend that lecture, I really recommend it. Eddie Portnoy was my Yiddish teacher once upon a time. He's wonderful. He's really entertaining. And he's in charge of exhibitions at the YIVO Institute, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. So I want to give you just a taste of it. This is, it's a really interesting little history. And it's an example of this transnational Yiddish culture that we've been describing, something that traversed borders, that didn't know borders, that crisscrossed the ocean and crisscrossed continents, you know, in order to reach Jews everywhere. So Yossel Cutler and Zuni Maud, these two guys, were the creators of a Yiddish puppet theater that fused traditional Jewish folklore and modern politics and had this left-wing sensibility, very satirical. They met in the late 19-teens in the offices of this magazine called Der Große Kundis, which means the great prankster. It was this comedy magazine. They were both illustrators there, and they met there, became fast friends, and originally made puppets at the behest of Morris Schwartz, who was the founder and director of the Yiddish Art Theater, this experimental theater in New York. He was going to put on a play that involved Yiddish puppets. And ultimately, when they made the puppets, they were really excited. They got to work, made all these puppets. And then Schwartz decided they were too small to be seen on the stage. So he cut the puppets out. So they were left with all these puppets. They began to perform these little shows they would make up with the puppets in various cafes, they would attend, they would frequent. And they would just perform for friends. And eventually somebody said, you should start a theater. And they did. And it was a smash hit. As odd as it seems. They created these little skits where they performed parody and comedy and political satire with these puppets. By and I cannot explain how popular this was. By the mid 1920s, they were performing 9 shows a week, all sold out shows. And they were touring up and down the Eastern Seaboard, parts of the Midwest, Cuba. They were all over the place, and people were hungry for these puppets. In 1929 and 1930, they traveled to Europe with their puppets. They were invited to go to Europe and go on tour. In Warsaw, they played 200 sold-out shows, followed by 75 sold-out shows in Vilna. So people were just desperate to see them. And then in 1931 to 32, they were invited to the Soviet Union, where they wrote and performed scripts on, the working class, on sweatshops, on sort of Soviet themes. And they were a smash hit there as well. And this is a picture of them. The woman in the middle is Bessie Maud, married to Zuni Maud. And this is them with their puppets. And you can see they're highly political puppets. And then it all came to a halt in 1933 when Cutler and Maud had a falling out. We don't know what the fight was about, but they had a falling out, and they broke up the act, and that was it. And then, there's a lot more to say, but what I will say is that these are some of the surviving puppets from that era in full color. These are held at the YIVO Institute in New York. And, there is so much more to say. There is so much more Yiddish history and culture to explore. Of course, through the Second World War. The Second World War does not stop Yiddish culture. Yiddish culture develops during the Second World War. Of course, after the Second World War, it develops in the ghettos. It develops in the camps. And there are post-war Yiddish centers to explore. There's Argentina. There's Montreal, South Africa even. And so, we could talk about this forever. I'm going to rein myself in for now. And I just want to end on this. I want to leave you a little bit hungry for more Yiddish. I want to skip ahead, way, way ahead to 1978. Why 1978? 1978 is when Isaac Bashevis Singer wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I want to share with you some of 2 small excerpts from his acceptance speech, which I think summarize what I have tried to share with you about Yiddish culture, about its origins, about its history, about its trajectory. So here we go. We'll leave it to Bashevis. He said, "The high honor bestowed upon me by the Swedish Academy is also a recognition of the Yiddish language, a language of exile, without a land, without frontiers, not supported by any government, a language which possesses no words for weapons, ammunition, military exercises, war tactics, a language that was despised by both Gentiles and emancipated Jews." And then later on in the speech, he says, "Yiddish has not yet said its last word. It contains treasures that have not been revealed to the eyes of the world. It was the tongue of martyrs and saints, of dreamers and Kabbalists, rich in humor and in memories that mankind may never forget. In a figurative way, Yiddish is the wise and humble language of us all, the idiom of frightened and hopeful humanity." So we'll leave it there. I think Bashevis said it best. And I just want to thank you all for coming on this journey with me. Like I said, we could talk forever, but we'll have to leave it here.
Miriam, thank you. This has just been absolutely wonderful. This taste, this time of Yiddish culture and language that you've given us. over the last couple of weeks has been so fascinating. I just want to open the floor to, I guess it's not really a floor anymore, is it? But open things up to some questions. We've got a few more minutes. And
before we go into questions, I just quickly want to share two more things, some resources for further exploration, because like you said, a tom of Yiddish, this is nicht genug, it's not enough. If folks are interested in continuing to explore Yiddish culture this summer, the YIVO Institute, which I've mentioned a couple of times, YIVO does online courses. During the pandemic, they have opened, they usually cost, they're not expensive, I think they're about $20, but they've opened them up for free during the pandemic. They still are free until the end of August. So if you're sitting home like I am, waiting for the border to open, waiting for the airports to really open around the world, check out these courses. They're wonderful. There's one on the history of the Yiddish stage called Oh Mama, I'm in Love. There's one on Jewish life in Eastern Europe. There's one on Jewish folklore. They're wonderful. The other thing is the Yiddish Book Center. The Yiddish Book Center, which I've also mentioned sort of in passing a few times, is an incredible resource. They are the largest repository of Yiddish books in the world. They are also an educational, a real, I would say, trailblazer in Yiddish education. They help translators become Yiddish translators. They help publish those translations. They're constantly coming out with new Yiddish translations into English of works never before translated. They do an amazing array of educational programming, some of which is available virtually. There's a whole virtual public programs calendar. You can keep up with upcoming talks they do, presentations online. There's a whole catalog, though, from the last year of virtual presentations that you can watch from months ago. I really recommend it. So I will also send Karen some links to those. Like I said, here's one advertising. I don't know if you can see this. There you are. The talk tomorrow night on the Modikat Yiddish Puppet Theater. I really recommend it. I will be in attendance. I will be in the audience. I can't wait for that one. Okay, with that, Karen, sorry, I won't interrupt you.
No,
Go
not
ahead.
at all. Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that you'll put together a reference sheet, and once we have that and any other links that you think we might find interesting and useful, we'll send that out by email. And possibly post it on our social media as well. So for questions, you can either type it into the chat, or you can raise your hand digitally, or wave frantically, which is the least preferable option. Actually, I'm going to start. I have a question about Birobidzhan. So, I mean, it seems pretty obvious that it was placed where it was to get the Jews as far away from Moscow as possible. Were there any Jews there at all before this was set up as an autonomous region, or were they all sort of transplanted?
Okay, no. So they were transplanted. Birobidzhan was not exactly founded in order to be a Jewish autonomous region, but it seemed like, I don't know why they chose it. I mean, we could probably guess why they chose it, and probably a few reasons. Originally, it's a really hostile environment. It's surrounded, there's got these high mountains on one side, and it's like swampy. Like, it's really not, you can't really farm it. Like, it's really not a place you want to go and live. And it's far. It's really, really far from, the center of the world for these people, which is really in Europe. And originally, I think it was founded as a way to kind of get rid of some troublesome Cossacks during one of these wars in the Russian Empire, and they kind of put them in Birobidzhan to exile them, to get them away from the centers of power and other people, as like a punishment almost. And there was sort of this local population there for a while, and then all of a sudden in the 1930s, these Jews start shipping these Jews in, and the population becomes like 30,000 Jews. It's kind of remarkable. But yeah, I don't know. It wasn't empty of people. It just certainly was not on any Jewish person's radar before that. Certainly not.
Thanks. Any other questions? Okay. I think we're probably done for the evening.
I see a raised hand from Peter.
Sorry, I didn't see that before. Go ahead, Peter.
No, actually, it's Joy.
Go ahead, Joy.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, number one, we know from a Canadian perspective that a lot of the Jews ended up landing on the East Coast because Canada was giving away land. And because of that, they then put them on trains and moved them west. Was that not the case when it came to the United States? That the fact that there were so many millions of Jews literally crammed into the Lower East Side boggles the mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a really, really interesting question. There certainly were certain Jews who were going out, especially in the, I have to remember when this was. There were various projects driven by socialist ideals to establish Jewish farming colonies. And this is something that there were certain ideas. This must have been around the same time. It must have been the 1920s. And one of them was Galveston, Texas. They believed that Galveston would be, they could set up a Jewish farming colony in Galveston. So there's this Galveston project that certain Jews end up making their way to Galveston. You know, certainly other Jews make their way across the US and west, you know. I think what happens is that New York, of course, is the port. And what happens is because there's already a Jewish presence there, starting in the there have been Jews in the US since the 1600s, but because there's such a large Jewish presence there already in the 1880s, I think people they come and they don't leave. Why would you leave, right? There's Jews, there's community, there's a shul, there's a school, there's Yiddish. And it does boggle the mind. You're right. It's a really interesting question. Why? I don't know if listen, the U.S. certainly was not a welcoming place necessarily. There was a lot of racism in the press. There was a lot of political cartoons. There was a lot of vilification of new immigrants. There was, they were not at all supportive of this wave of people coming in, not just Jews, but certainly including Jews. And I think they were overwhelmed by the number of people. I think that might have actually been it, just bad governing. I'm not really sure, because it's a great question. Why were they sort of allowed to stay? And I don't really have a good answer for you. Certainly, they effectively closed the border in 1924. They decided enough is enough. Because who knows how many more would have come, right? Considering how good life was. People were writing letters home and saying, life's pretty good here. It's hard, it's poor, but it's better than it was in Poland, And so I think people would have kept coming. I think New York was already a big city. It had, I wouldn't say space, because you're right, they were crammed into the Lower East Side, but it had, I think it was an access point for people. It had, in a funny way, there's no space, but there's room for growth in certain ways. There were already buildings, there were already places to inhabit, there were already certain social structures set up. So I think people stayed. And these are people coming from enormously overcrowded places already. I don't think that, on a personal level, I don't think they were deterred by that. I think they were a little bit surprised by the conditions in what they called the golden in Medina, the golden land. It was not so golden and so rosy, it turned out, but fascinating question. I need to learn more about it, about the Jews who did move westward. Thank you for asking.
Thanks. Yeah, if you haven't done so already and you have the chance to be in New York, take a walking tour of the Lower East Side and visit the Jewish Tenement Museum. It's just amazing. It's and fascinating. I think a lot of people who came had relatives here already, or a cousin of a cousin of a cousin. So they were kind of reunifying families in a sense when they settled in the Lower East Side.
The immigration pattern of Jews who came especially to New York is really interesting. Like I think first of all, we're talking about, this is the period of global migration. People are moving from all over the world to all kinds of places. And, you have Lithuanians, you have Ukrainians, you have Italians who are all coming to New York. The interesting thing about Jewish immigration in that period is that whereas Ukrainians, Poles, Italians, others, Lithuanians tended to come, the men tended to come to work for a few years, earn some money, and then they would go back home. There's a very high rate of return. Jews tended to immigrate as families. You took your whole nuclear family and you went and you stayed. And that's a very interesting that's a unique feature among immigrants of that time. And that's something that, demographers have talked about, that Jewish immigration was permanent. And it wasn't always true for everybody who was coming at that time. So yeah, Jews were definitely looking for a new home. They had enough of the Russian Empire. They were done,
It's interesting that, Joy, you talked about Canada. It's interesting that the Jews who didn't settle in Montreal and Toronto and who went farther west or who went into smaller towns across the country, quite often as merchants and sometimes as farmers, but eventually, by, I don't know the exact timelines, but certainly by the 60s and 70s, we're back in Toronto and Montreal. So they were re-urbanizing, I guess, back to where the Jewish infrastructure existed.
It's just interesting though, because I have been down to the Lower East Side in New York, and the books I've read, both fiction and nonfiction, the Golden Medina was not so golden. I mean, they were crammed into tiny, itty bitty little spaces with one washroom that serviced a whole floor of people. I mean, it was a very hard life. And in my mind, you would think that at some point you would get a leader, whether it would be a rabbi or a political leader, who would say, okay, let's look for a better place to live because this isn't so golden.
Yeah, I think there are multiple components that create the situation for Jews and create a situation that they end up staying in those conditions. I think part of it is that, suburbs don't really exist yet. So the idea of, it's cheaper now it's really expensive to live in the city. Then it was much cheaper to live in the city than it was to go out and live somewhere on a homestead, right? And I think, and suburbs, like I say, had not been established yet. Suburbs come later. And so this idea that you can go out of the city and have affordable housing is it's an idea from generations later. And I think, in some ways, I think these people were sort of trapped there. I don't know if anybody wanted to stay, but I don't think they felt like they had any other options. And this is something, all groups felt this way. The Chinese begin to found Chinatown. The Italians begin to found Little Italy. So this is all happening at the same time. And I think these are people who are poor. They come here with nothing. They still have nothing once they get here, and there's just nowhere for them to go. And so,
so they go.
Ideal, right?
Yeah, I think religious observance played a big part especially for the Eastern European Jews who were more religious than maybe the more quote unquote enlightened Western European Jews. That they by staying in the Lower East Side or areas like that, there was always a minyan and you could get kosher food.
True, very true.
The other thing too that you mentioned, and I just want to comment on, you said that the Jews came by families and stayed. Really what happened in many, many cases was dad came, established himself in whatever way he could, whether he came to Canada or to the United States, and then sent for mom and the 17 kids. And they came and stayed.
Right. The difference being that, he didn't then return to Poland.
Right.
That this was, the goal was to come in piecemeal if you had to, but to come and to stay, to settle. Yeah.
And often sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, often that was simply a matter of economics. They could afford one ticket.
Absolutely.
The head of the family came over in order and worked long enough to acquire enough money to send to the wife, and the wife came with the kids if there were kids, or alone if there weren't.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've got a question about Yiddish language in the chat. Hang on one second. Let me just go Back up to it. Yeah. Any suggestions for a person with no background to learn Yiddish if Duolingo isn't cutting it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Duolingo. Duolingo is a lot of fun, but yeah, it's not exactly, um, it's not for everybody, put it that way. And it makes it fun. It makes it really fun. But I think if you're looking for a more sort of focused and thorough, grammar education, vocabulary education, yeah, certainly there are so many places to learn Yiddish today. I think I said at some point in the last couple of weeks that the pandemic has actually done wonders for Yiddish in the world, that now it seems there are more opportunities to learn Yiddish than ever before. They're all online and it's really, really great. There are some, okay, so here in the city, the Committee for Yiddish, I will put that down. Committee for Yiddish, which is a committee of the UJA Federation. They're a volunteer committee of people who do all kinds of Yiddish programming. They offer Yiddish courses throughout the year. They do them in sort of semesters, like 10 or 12-week semesters. So just go on their website and check it out. That's the Committee for Yiddish. Another one, an online one. This one's based in San Diego that I really recommend. Yana with triple A. It's the Yiddish, what does it stand for? The Yiddish Arts and Academics Association of North America, something like that. They offer a range of Yiddish courses all online. The Workers' Circle in New York offers, we have a Workmen's Circle branch here, of course. The one in New York is really the headquarters, and they offer also a range of very, very high quality Yiddish courses. In addition, there's a new one called, I think it's called Yiddish with Reb Noach. That's another one. So, I mean, there is just like a crazy number of Yiddish courses you can take. They're all really, really good. YIVO also. YIVO offers language courses. I think they will start to offer the next semester in the fall. So keep an eye out for that. But there are summer courses happening on Yana, the one in San Diego. Yana is starting their summer courses like next week, I think. So check that out. And yeah, the Workers' Circle does classes year round as well with an all-star, cast of faculty, an all-star faculty from around the world. Everybody, all the best Yiddish teachers end up teaching a class for either the Workers' Circle or for YIVO. Yeah, there are many, many wonderful opportunities to learn to actually speak. And they go from absolute beginners all the way to, very advanced conversational Yiddish. So check that out. Yeah.
Excellent.
And Carla said to be successful at Duolingo, I can't imagine doing it without previous Hebrew. I came to Yiddish with Hebrew. So yeah, it certainly helps to learn the alphabet, but I've also taught dozens of students Yiddish, and they've done really well in Yiddish, and they come to the classroom with, first of all, they're not Jewish. They've never seen a Hebrew letter before, and they come out, speaking beautiful Yiddish. And it's a very challenging adjustment period in the beginning, learning to read the script, which tends to look like a bunch of squares to most people at first. Learning to read, right to left. It's an adjustment, certainly, and it does take people some time, but it is definitely possible. So if your Hebrew is not, fluent, don't worry, don't be deterred. You can.
I think it's that Duolingo assumes that you know the alphabet. It does not teach you the alphabet.
That's
it's
true.
A big surprise when I'm like, I wonder what letter that is.
Oh, you know what? To learn the alphabet, let me the Aleph Beis, as it's called. Check out the Yiddish Book Center. There's a section on their website, there's a tab called Language and Literature. And they do a couple of like quick exercises that help you learn the alphabet. And there's audio, so you can mouse over a letter and you'll hear what it sounds like. And yeah, it's very, very, so check that out for learning alphabet. Yeah.
I'll just add to that actually that Kolami offers Hebrew reading classes sometimes in some years. And while it's read slightly differently in Hebrew and in Yiddish, at least then you get the basics of how to read the letters.
There you go, in-house.
Thank you.
Back to Bergelson. So Carlos asking, the article you sent describes 3 centers for Yiddish centers. For Yiddish culture, I guess it seems to indicate that Russia was a real mecca for Yiddish culture, but then it's broken between classes, the intelligentsia and the poorer subsistence Jewish artisans. She doesn't understand Bergelson's argument that Russian was the Yiddish promised land. Can you comment on that?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting article. I think in general, I think Bergelson is just sort of really taken with the romance of the promises of the Soviet Union in the early years. I think he's just really excited about the idea. I mean, first of all, the economic system in that the Soviet Union proposes, the communist system, is really different from the systems these people are coming out of, right? It's really different from the system in Imperial Russia. It's really different from the systems in well, I mean, each of the new countries that come out of the Treaty of Versailles are forming their own systems, they're forming, whether they're democracies, whether they're capitalist societies, they're not communist. That's a Soviet thing. And so I think he's really charmed. He's totally just, flown away with the idea of communism, the idea that there is no such thing as, well, supposedly there's no such thing as class anymore, and the worker is the hero of us all. I think he's just really in love with that idea, and which is why he's so hard on Poland and America. He finds them to be just like capitalists, like cesspools, and he's not interested at all. And I think, yeah, he does acknowledge, certainly, of course, Russian society is variegated, just like every society. And he does recognize, yeah, there's an intelligentsia, and yeah, there's the artisan class, but what the thing here is that he says, the thing is that, if you compare the Jewish artisan class in Poland and the Jewish artisan class in the Soviet Union, the ones in Poland are trapped in this system they're never going to get out of. And they're also, he believes that they're sort of consumed with this capitalist idea of just working to survive. You're never going to get anywhere, and maybe you'll get somewhere, but maybe not. He just finds it really uninspiring in a place like Poland. But he finds, listen, he talks about in that essay, he talks about Mendel Merchosvarim, and he talks about Shalom Aleichem, he talks about that earlier Shtetl literature. He says, we've graduated from that. In other words, he's looking at the economic situation in those stories of Jews, living in the Pale, and he says, we're beyond that. That was our history. This is our future. And he's really interested in promoting and realizing that Soviet ideal. That, so many of these writers were so taken with that idea because it was so radical, it was so new, and they were so optimistic about it. It was so different from what they had known. So I think, it's Russia as a Yiddish promised land for that reason, because it presents a totally different option, and I think that's sort of the key. I hope that helps.
The ultimate irony that he will be slaughtered by the Russians.
Right. He himself was executed in 1952. It was a very misled. They were very misled, and it's a really sad story. But there was this incredible flowering of culture in the early years that is so important to when we think about the history of Yiddish culture.
Great. Do we have any more questions? I think we're good. So I just posted in the chat the link to the Kolami YouTube channel. If you want to rewatch any of these, tonight's lecture will be posted later in the week. And again, thank you to everybody who's been here for these lectures. They've been great, and hopefully we'll get together again sometime soon in the future. We wish you all the best with your doctorate. And
thank you.
really, you are so passionate and knowledgeable, and it's really just been a pleasure having you share all of that with us.
It has been a pleasure to join you. Thank you so much. It's been such a delight to get to know this group, and good luck mit dem rechten Fuß, as they say, with the right foot on your future Yiddish journeys, on your future Jewish learning. It's a wonderful thing that you're doing, and I think this is a wonderful group, and I'm so happy to be here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thanks, everybody. Good night. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. It was great seeing you.
Good night, all.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you.